Yeah, I need you on the daily. Couple weeks and I'd go crazy. Yeah, I need you on the regular. Yeah, I need you, yeah, I'm telling ya. Yeah, I need you on the daily.
Hi, welcome to Devos with Debbie. Today we're going to jump right in with 2 Corinthians 7-9. So again, a little context. We're right now in the time of Prophet Elisha, and I'll probably mispronounce that a few times and say Elisha instead of Elisha, so I apologize in advance. And just some political context. Again, there are two different kingdoms within the nation of Israel. There's the Jewish people. They've divided into the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And they have sort of joined forces against the king of Syria named Ben-Hadad. And there's a famine in the land. So that's enough context. Basically, Elisha says, there's going to be food. God's going to provide food. And there's this one skeptical man who says, if the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? So he's like super skeptical, even questioning God's power. Of course God can open windows in heaven. He's all powerful. But his ignorance is met with God's miraculous provision, and it's in a very interesting way. Essentially, there are these 4 lepers that we're introduced to, and they're at the entrance to the gate, and they're talking to each other, and they're basically like, we're going to die anyways. We're going to die sitting here. We're going to die if we go into the city, and so why don't we just try to go over to the camp of the Syrians and see if they'll have pity on us? And with that, they creep up to the camp of the Syrians, and they notice no one is there. And basically, God had done a miracle and had confused the Syrians, making them hear the sound of chariots and horses, and they thought it was this great army that was coming to them. So they freaked out and they went running. And later we learned, like, they literally left everything. They left their tents, their horses, their donkeys, their food, and they fled for their lives. It even says later that they have like this trail of clothes that they're just like dropping everything they can so they can get out of there as fast as possible, which is slightly comical. And so these lepers feast. They like eat all the food. They grab silver and gold. They're like grabbing clothing, and they're living their best life right now. And then they have this moment, which I feel like is so profound for those of us who are living in this New Testament reality, you know. It says, verse 9 of chapter 7, "We're not doing this right," they say to each other. "This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household." And, you know, part of this is fear. They're basically like, if we don't say anything, we're going to get in trouble. This is not a good idea. We got to go right away. We can't just like hog all this for ourselves and also miss the opportunity that this scenario, this situation has given us. But one of the things that I just can't get out of my head is that they say, we're not doing this right. This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until morning light, like, punishment will overtake us. Good news cannot wait for the darkness to pass. Good news has an urgency attached to it, and an excitement. And silence does not pair well with good news. And I feel like this relates immediately to us who have been given good news in the middle of the night, in the middle of this darkness that we're surrounded in this world. And the good news is that Jesus has come to set us free from our sins, to restore us back to the family of God, and to open a way for us to be with God forever. What amazing news is that? It's incredible. It's good news. And yet we're silent and we're just waiting for the light, waiting for morning comes and we benefit from this good news. We're the only ones who benefit. We got our plunder. We ate our fill. And yet it's not right. This isn't the way that good news was designed to be. And good news is designed to be shared even in the middle of the night because the morning light is coming. There's urgency. So again, this analogy just keeps hitting me. So I hope it hits you the way it's hitting me. So these 4 lepers get to be the bearer of good news, the most unlikely candidates, and furthermore, probably the most weak, and yet they have found a camp that's totally empty. And so there's a little doubt around them. They're like when they tell the king's household, the king has to double check, and sure enough, they see the trail of clothes that the Syrians left. They're freaking out. So anyways, the people go back and they plunder the camp of Syria. And lo and behold, the man who showed skepticism and said, if God opened, he says, if the Lord himself should make the windows in heaven, could such a thing be? Unfortunately, because of his skepticism, he basically gets, trampled? I can't remember. But he dies. Yeah, he gets trampled. That's kind of a sad part of this story. But we also, in this context, just see how intense this famine is. Everybody's affected. The Syrians, the Israelites. People are desperate, and yet it's coming to a close. And Elisha had warned a woman that he had been particularly invested in. We don't actually have her name. We just call her the Shunammite. And just for a little context, this is the woman who prepared a room for Elisha whenever he passed by. And because of that, he said, you're going to have a son, even though you're barren and your husband is of old age. And she does. And then that son dies. And then Elisha. Oh, Elisha. Elisha raises the son to life. So this is a woman in a family that Elisha cares a lot about. And he had basically warned this woman about this famine and sent her off. And she was wandering in the land of the Philistines, sojourning with her household. And then after 7 years, she returned to her land but didn't own it anymore. And basically her land gets restored to her. So that's a little mini sidebar. And then now we're going to launch into this whole network of king political drama. So again, I have a little tiny chart that I just keep adding to of the 2 sides. But right now, Jehoshaphat is the king, and in Israel, Joram is the king. But it looks like Jehoshaphat dies, and his son begins to rule, named Jehoram. And Jehoram is an evil king, and he does not do the will of the Lord. He does evil in the sight of the Lord, and he walks in the ways of his father, just like his, not his father, but grandfather or something, just like Ahab. and was not good. In fact, he's even married to the daughter of Ahab. And Ahab and Jezebel just really were entrenched in idolatry. And so, with this, we still see God's faithfulness. Like, even when we are not faithful, God is faithful. Verse 19 of chapter 8 says, "Yet the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah for the sake of David his servant, since he promised to give a lamp to him and to his sons forever." And again, we just see the incredible faithfulness of God, even when we are faithless, even when the kings just totally screw up and are so irreverent and go and worship after other gods and such. God is still faithful because he made a promise to King David. And so, yes, we have a bad king, Jehoram, and after Jehoram, Ahaziah starts to rule. Still, we're in the rule of the Israelite king Joram. And so Ahaziah and Joram try together to defeat the king of Syria, Hazael. Oh, I think I missed that. I totally missed that part. Sorry. So Ben-Hadad was the king of Syria, and he sends his servant Hazael to Elisha to figure out if he will get better. He's like, will I get better or will I die? And Elisha says, yeah, you're gonna get better, but you're still gonna die. And he basically foretells that Hazael will kill his king. And Hazael does become king. But we have this interesting moment that Elisha has where he starts to weep in front of this servant Hazael. And Hazael's like, why are you weeping? And he says, because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. You will set on fire their fortresses, and you will kill their young men and the sword, and dash in pieces their little ones, and rip open their pregnant women. And this is like such a heartbreaking revelation to Elisha, thinking about the pain that his people are about to endure. And so Syria, not looking so great in the eyes of the Lord right now. So back to what I was saying, Ahaziah and Joram are trying to defeat Hazael together, and Joram gets wounded. And God sends Elisha to anoint Jehu to be king. And he is later proclaimed to be king as news spreads, and he announces it. And people honor this anointing that Elisha has done. And they even take off their garments and put it under him so that he can walk on their cloaks. And it must be a tradition, because we see later in, like a custom, we see later in the book, in the Gospels, when Jesus has his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, they spread their cloaks on the pathway for him to walk across. So it is announcing a new king for Judah that has been anointed. So Jehu makes his first move as king, a quite violent one, and he skillfully draws both the king of Judah and the king of Israel, Ahaziah and Joram, to him, and he kills them both. But before he does, he says, like, what peace can there be so long as whorings and sorceries of your mother Jezebel are so many? And he's quite intense with this statement, but he's basically saying there is no peace right now. You guys are just practicing idolatry, and that's not going to bring you peace. Again, sometimes I get a little mixed with the timeline of these things, Jezebel and such, but the news is clear. Jehu is now anointed king of Israel, and Ahaziah, is no longer king. I think. Well, let's just keep moving. So, so just jumping to Psalm 109, we get this mini look into David's kingship again, which is quite relevant to the passage we just read in 2 Kings, just because David's rule was so important to God that he continues to work through David's lineage. Even though there are just some real messed up people in that lineage, God is faithful even when the people are faithless. And yeah, this is a cry of desperation of David. And he's basically like, God, fight on behalf of my people. And he just calls down all the things he wants to happen to his enemy. And one thing I really appreciate about David is he doesn't really hide his emotions, or he's not afraid to ask God the things that he wants to happen. And I think this is something I'm sort of learning, is we don't have to say the right things to God. Our prayers don't have to be scripted or fed through a filter. God just wants us to pour out our hearts to him and ask him what's on our heart. And it's probably not what is in the will of God, but he wants us to ask it. He wants us to pour our hearts out. And so David pours his heart out. And in this, we also see his incredible humility and his very deep awareness that he is both physically and spiritually needy. He knows that he needs to be humble in the presence of God, and he knows that he needs God. And this is shown through a couple verses towards the end, but especially this. I'm going to just read it. It says, verse 21, starting there. But you, O God, my Lord, deal on my behalf for your name's sake, because your steadfast love is good. Deliver me. For I am poor and needy, and my heart is stricken within me. I am gone like a shadow at evening. I am shaken off like a locust. My knees are weak through fasting. My body has become gaunt, with no fat. And I am an object of scorn to my accusers. When they see me, they wag their heads. Help me, O Lord my God. Save me according to your steadfast love. Let them know that this is your hand. You, O Lord, have done it. And it keeps going. I wasn't even going to read that much, but we just see David's incredible humility, incredible dependence on the Lord, understanding his position in creation, that he's just nothing, he's gone like the wind. And yet he knows that God is able to help him. And he wants God to get the credit, not himself. He's like, so that people will know that you did it, Lord. So that's it for that verse. We're going to jump into, or that passage, we're going to jump into Matthew 20. And we have this fascinating story. This is a parable that Jesus is telling his disciples. And yes, he talks about the kingdom of heaven being like a master who hires laborers to work in his vineyard. And he starts with a working wage of a denarius a day. And he sends them out into the vineyard. And he sees some people who are just waiting around in the marketplace. And he's like, well, I'll pay you if you want to work in my field. And he does this 3 times, at the 3rd hour, 6th hour, and 9th hour. So we kind of have 4 shifts here. One shift has worked all day. One shift has worked a lot of the day. One shift has worked not as much, and one shift has worked very little. And at the end, he calls all the laborers back to himself to pay them their wages. And he starts with the last who were hired, and then he goes to the first. And he gives the last he hired a denarius, and then the second last a denarius, and the third last a denarius, and finally the last a denarius. And I can imagine the people sitting there thinking like, oh, wait a minute, I worked longer. You hired me way in the beginning of the day. I've worked all day, and they got the exact same wage as I did. And this is what Jesus says, this is what Jesus says that the master says. Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Like, that's the wage we agreed on. Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first and the first last. And in this we learn a couple things. One is that there's no greater or lesser reward in heaven when it comes to eternal life. Even if we served God all our lives, or were the thief on the cross on the side next to Jesus who repents, and Jesus says, like, this day you're going to be with me in paradise. And the thief on the cross had no chance to live this redeemed, righteous life. But Jesus gave him eternal life nonetheless, for that repentant heart. And really, I'm again thinking about other passages when the last chapter of John, when Jesus is talking to Peter, and Peter says, like, well, what about this guy? Like, what's his calling? Like, what's he going to do? And Jesus says, like, don't look at him. You follow me. Like, it does not matter what I do with him. You follow me. And the same, like, mentality goes perfectly along with this passage, that we aren't to be looking and comparing ourselves to other people and what God's giving them and how much and how long they've been faithful or whatnot. God is generous, and he will give to us as he wants to give to us. And he doesn't think the way we think. He has this economy where the last will be first and the first will be last. How can we possibly begin to understand that in our earthly minds? So that's an awesome lesson. And just because of time, I'm not going to get into the rest of these stories that he tells. Maybe I will. Okay. So Jesus foretells his death a third time to his disciples. And I think this is really important because Jesus is fully aware of what he's going into, fully aware of what his ministry is leading him to, and the kind of suffering that he will be facing, but also the victory. But he also prepares his disciples for this suffering and for this what's coming, even though his disciples are still like taken off guard by all this, even though he said it over and over. Jesus is gracious in that repetition to his disciples, knowing that they're just not going to fully understand it, but they need that time to hear it over and over again. Next, we also see Jesus again saying this. This is Matthew 20:28. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as ransom for many. And this is basically when he's saying, if you want to be great, you got to be a servant. If you want to be first, you got to be a slave. Just like Jesus came to serve others, not to be served. And this is something I'm trying to learn myself, having this mentality of serving others, not seeking that personal gain or glory. Because we are not better than Jesus, and Jesus was crucified and mocked and scorned and flogged. So we follow in his footsteps, loving others, serving others, not here to be served. Still working on that one. And finally, let's just jump into 2 Timothy 2. And again, Paul is writing to Timothy, and he's giving his advice to Timothy. And he gives 3 different images: a good soldier, a athlete, and a hardworking farmer. And they're just in verses back to back to back. And some of the things we learned from them, I just chose a couple characteristics to associate with each image he gives. Basically saying the soldier does not entangle in civilian pursuits. So, like a soldier, we are to be focused and devoted, not entangled in things of this world, but focused and devoted. 2, he talks about an athlete who competes according to the rules. And one thing we can glean from this is that we are to be authentic and honest. A athlete that takes with steroids, or cheats along the way is not going to get his reward in the long run, or will have some disgrace attached to him with his victory later on. It's going to get discovered. And that's not how we operate in the kingdom of God. That's not how believers and followers of Jesus are to be. We are to be authentic and honest. And finally, a hardworking farmer who ought to have the first share of the crops. Basically saying, work hard. This is what it means to be a disciple of God. Focused and devoted on and devoted to the Lord and the things of the Lord. Authentic and honest and hardworking. And this verse I've mentioned before today, just in recapping some of the points, but verse 13 says, it's recounting what God is. I'll read 11, 12, and 13. It says, if we have died with him, being Jesus, we will also live with him. If we endure with him, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. And we just see this incredible characteristic of our God, which is faithfulness. Like, he is faithful, even if we stink and we are totally faithless. He's faithful. And later, Paul gets into being careful with how we say, like not being quarrelsome, especially within believers, circles of believers, and without circles of believers. But he says, another image, he says, like, there are vessels in the house that are used for good and for bad. And, some are made of gold and silver, and some are made of wood and clay. But it doesn't really matter what it's made for. Some are for honorable use, and some are for dishonorable use. And basically, for it to be for honorable use, it has to be cleansed on the inside, regardless of what it's made of, so that it can be set apart and useful for what is honorable. And I think this is really valuable when it comes to looking at our own lives and sin. Like, God has made us for honorable use. He wants us to be used for his kingdom. And yet, if we don't have that cleansing on the inside, the outside doesn't matter. You can look at good and pristine as possible. But if we don't have that cleansing on the inside, we're of no use. We can only be used for dishonorable things. So after that, Paul dives in and says, flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Wow. That's just such wisdom right there. So we're just going to end on that. Have a good day. Bye.